Hi folks, how you doing? Going to try and get these reviews in for Richard Lehman while I can. Still got 33 books to talk about before I can move on to another author. But I got thinking the other day. There's a few reasons why I'm doing these sort of reviews in order for Richard Lehman books. I mentioned a couple of those reasons already, but there's a channel just generically called Horror Reviews Channel that was by this English guy who had moved to Russia, and as far as I can find, he's the only channel on YouTube that has reviewed 35 Lehman books, but he has also reviewed the short story collections. I'm reviewing 37, so there's two novels that I'm going to be talking about that he hasn't reviewed. But his channel was the only channel that spoke about Lehman in any sort of informative way. He reviewed other authors like Wilbur Smith, Dean Koontz, Stephen King, Bentley Little, who I'll get onto later after Lehman. But his channel stopped 3 years ago. He'd done, I think, 89 videos, and yeah, just stopped. Now I know the guy was in a bit of ill health. He was about my age. He had a persistent cough and cold, and I don't like to think the worst, but I get a horrible feeling that something happened to this guy. Um, tragic, because of just why would he stop his channel for no real reason? Now, if I'm wrong and he's still with us and he's healthy and just decided to get off YouTube because he believes it's toxic, etc., that's fair enough. But there's a part of me that feels that something happened to that guy, which is not only a tragedy in its own right, but quite sad in the fact that this is a person that I've never met. I don't know, but his channel was great. I encourage you to check it out. And his love for Richard Lehman books, he made a lot of valid criticisms, the same sort of ones I'm making, to be honest. But his love for horror in general was infectious, and his delivery of reviews was far better than anything I can do. And I think I'm going to continue to do this series, if for no other reason than in homage and tribute to a man I've never met, but whose reviews touched me, to be honest. And I think I owe it to him to complete this series in as best a way I can. So yeah, if he's out there and he's ever watching by the mention of the name or checks out my channel, then just let me know you're alive. That's basically it, just something quite sad about it, really, quite tragic. Anyway, especially considering I know that he had a wife, he had a young child. I just wonder what became of him. One of life's mysteries, really. Anyway, on to the reviews, and we're at number 33 on this reviews list now. And for 33, I've chosen an odd one that I don't really see many people talk about. It's a novel called Cuts, and it was released in 1999 at that end point of Richard Lehman's career. And it's a novel that was rejected in the UK. You can buy it, but it's an import. But it was released in the States, which is mad considering, for most of Lehman's career, the States weren't really touching his books. You had to import them, and all of a sudden we had a book that was rejected in the UK that you could buy in the States. Although you have to buy sort of like second-hand paperback copies now. But it's an odd one because the later portion of Lehman's career, I'll get into the books individually. There's kind of three tiers of books that he released towards the end of his career. And when I look at books released, especially at this latter part of his career, I sort of question, was it written at that point in time, or was it even written by him? Cuts was definitely written by Lehman, but I don't believe it was written in the late 90s as released. I believe it was written a lot earlier in his career and rejected and picked up on because of the fact that towards the end of the 90s he was really picking up pace in America, and his novels had definitely started to increase in quality again. And Cuts finds itself at number 33 on this list because it obviously isn't one of his better books. Another reason why I don't believe it was written at the end of the 90s. But it's an odd one all round, regardless of when it was written and, for whatever reason. I believe it was rejected owing to the fact that it just wasn't a great book. And I believe someone at Quality Control had started to take notes, despite the fact that a lot of his mid to late 90s stuff was just tosh. You notice there's a certain timeline of a lot of the books released in terms of they're all at the lower end of this tier. They're all around the same time. Now, Cuts is a really odd book. There's only so much I can say about it without spoiling it, and I'm probably going to spoil certain parts, but I really have to with this one in order to describe what it is. So the focus of Cuts is the main villain. Now, I can't remember the names of the characters in this story, so it's been a while since I read it, but most of Layman's books, the focus is on the hero or heroine. Despite the sort of misogynistic nature of a lot of Layman's books, most of his heroines or heroes tend to be female. And that's sort of true with Cuts, but the main focus seems to be on this main character, this teenager who is incredibly sadistic and evil and violent. But in particular, whilst his murders are sexually motivated, he doesn't seem to be able to get aroused in the same way that most of Layman's cookie cutter villains are. He gets aroused by cutting his victims and then trying to have sex with the wounds, and particularly he'll slice open stomachs or legs and things and doing that. It kind of is a bit of a riff on the Beasts from the Beast House series, because they did similar things. If they couldn't find an opening, they'd bore their way in, which we'll get into. But in this one, this guy, that's how he kind of gets his jollies. So he's a really nasty guy, and we follow him for a large portion of this book as a sort of main character and just what he gets up to. And he's interesting because he is definitely a psychopath. He kind of comes across with his sort of natural charm and then just murders people left, right and centre without really thinking about any sort of consequence, which is what kind of makes him a bit more chilling than the average Layman character. He doesn't really care about who's around. He just drops and kills people and then moves on. But he is quite sly. But he's a teenager. He's not massively strong. He's not massively clever. He's just very sly and doesn't really care about the consequences. In between all this action, we have a whole series of other characters. A professor or teacher guy whose wife doesn't seem to care for him, and he begins this bizarre sort of story to find somebody else and meets all these weird characters in these bars. There's a few just really unlikable sort of characters set around campuses, like professors, teachers, students, and none of them are really likable. The main sort of like heroine isn't really introduced till much later into this book, which is what makes me think it's an early one. It's all over the place in terms of plot and story. It's really sort of odd in terms of how Layman's later books were generally, especially after 98, they were generally really well structured books until he died. And we'll talk about the books after he died as we go through. But this one's all over the place. It just feels very sort of cluttered and weirdly written. And despite the fact it's quite a short book, it's about 300 pages or so, it feels quite tedious in a lot of its story. I mean, its focus on this main killer does make it more interesting than the books I've mentioned up until this point, owing to the fact that there's a lot more action and there's a lot more stuff going on. But the fact that there's a serious lack of characters to root for early on it really drags it down. And I do like the fact that the main villain isn't the usual sadistic maniac, in that he doesn't sort of just rape his way through in the traditional way, but he is still the same sort of Layman maniac in that sense. He's just doing it with different parts. But what really throws this story out, and I'll tell you what, this is really weird. It's actually, it's got a bit of paint on my hand just noticed. It's structured into two parts. Part one is 99% of the book. Part two takes place, I think, about 20 years later, and is all of a handful of pages. And it's the most bizarre structure I've seen in terms of how it's laid out. The way in which this guy is subdued by the main female character in part one, the end of part one, has got to be one of the most out there moments in a Layman book. It's almost as if Layman wrote this murderous character and realised that he doesn't have sex in conventional manners, and then had to throw in some sort of conventional sex scene that was going to raise eyebrows and be shocking. And that's kind of how he finishes off part one. It's really just, I don't understand why the characters behave they do and how it all works, but it's just bizarre. It really is one of the more bizarre sort of endings. But then we've got like a scene that takes place about about 20 years later or something around that, 15, 20 years later, something like that. which kind of follows up events from part one with the offspring of the main character, and without saying too much, this villain again, in terms of can we get like a decent resolution to this villain. And it really is again just bizarre and weird how it's all over a couple of pages and it's ended, but it does give an ending. It's almost like Layman thought, hang on, that first ending isn't enough, I need another ending. Very weird structure. Very weird book, very one-dimensional. Like I say, the characters are all over the place and the structure's all over the place. But it's not... It wasn't like dull to read. It wasn't frustrating to read. I mean, this is a bad book. It's at number 33. It is a bad book. But I wouldn't say it's a terrible book. I didn't hate it. I don't think it's got the same amount of flaws as the previous ones. I'd read this over Island any day. It is bad. And we're talking layman standards, but by sort of conventional horror standards, this would be trash. Don't get into thinking this is anything other than a bad book, but it's a fascinatingly bad book. Some of these bad books are interesting, and this one's definitely an interesting bad book, but not one I'd recommend you track down if you're in the UK because of the fact that you've got to import it. But just a really odd book to have released at this point in Layman's career. Luckily, there aren't too many more bad books left to talk about. There was a couple, but not too many more bad books. We're going to go through a couple more bad ones, then a couple of sort of disappointing ones, then some iffy ones. Then we'll start getting to the decent list. Because like I say, Layman never wrote, in my opinion, a great book. But he did write some great trash. And his great books are the equivalent of what I'd say is like a B movie, stuff that I can still enjoy. They're not great works of literature, but they are fun horror novels, and I will get onto that. If it feels like I'm just bashing him, it's because I'm at the bottom of this tier still. But yeah, that's Cuts at number 33. Really interesting, bizarre book to have released this late into his career, rejected in the UK, and very odd, but interestingly, perversely fun in the fact that it's terrible, but you're just curious as to where it's all going. And it does contain some scenes that stuck with me. So, yeah, it's number 33.